Riot Chapter 6. With the night dew still clinging to his skin, Brian climbed back under his quilt, chilled. He fell into a fitful sleep, dreaming once of getting caught with a mallet in his hand and once of standing next to Chelsea in the grocery store, of all places, leaning forward to actually kiss her. His lips just about touched hers, but then her face turning into a wet nose and a hairy snout. Gretzky, gross. Come on, Sleepy, came Mom's voice from next to his bunk. She pushed Brian's hair away from his forehead. Time to get up. What time is it? He asked groggily, his mouth rancid as old potatoes. Nearly 11 o'clock. You know how fidgety Grandma Effie gets if we're late. She said noon, but she's sure to be pacing by now. From his great-grandparents' compact living room, Brian could see Alyssa and Josh sitting at the glass-top kitchen table, drinking milk and eating cookies. Being older had its privileges. At least Brian could eat in the living room. As the adults drank coffee, he dunked another sugar-sprinkled ginger snap in his glass of milk, let it soak for 3 seconds, and then popped it in his mouth. With grandparents in Arizona and St. Cloud, Brian actually felt closest to Grandma Effie and Grandpa Howie, his great-grandparents. He could visit them anytime he wanted to. The strike of 1934, Grandpa Howie said slowly, the words taking shape on this day, wrinkled lip, was part of Teamster history. It was something, Grandma Effie said. We lived in Minneapolis then. Stan was just born, youngest of 5. Her mind was still quick as her fingers darting the needle in and out of her quilting frame on her lap. I was down there in the soup kitchen keeping those men fed. Day and night, keeping their spirits up. Oh, and it was a long strike. Not like today. Things are easy today. Then she said, pausing to rethread her needle, men were fighting to earn enough money to feed their families. Some starved right in the streets. When things got bad, Grandpa added, it was hand-to-hand combat. He swung his left arm to demonstrate. His right arm, which years ago had gotten tangled in a paper machine, and it was a stub at the elbow beneath his pinned shirt sleeve. After Grandpa's accident, the union had pushed for safer working conditions. If we weren't fighting the police and their billy clubs, then Grandma just jumped in, and it was bloody. Let me finish, Grandpa ordered. If we weren't fighting the police, then it was a citizens' party, and they were folks, mostly in businesses, who had it in their heads that forming a union meant joining the Communist Party. Did it? Brian asked. Heck no, Grandpa said, but there was plenty of Reds around then. Brian glanced at Mom. She was staring past Grandpa, her fist pressed against her lips. Usually she reacted to the word Reds, slang for communists, but this time it went right past her. Brian couldn't see why it mattered anyway. It was only a word. Grandpa continued, especially in Minnesota. So people were nervous. We were fighting for our families, for our jobs. We worked 12 to 16-hour days, 6 days a week, and still we couldn't support our families. What kind of life is that? Not much of one, I tell you that. He leaned forward on his cane, his eyes half closed. Brian sat on Grandma's gold easy chair. He wished they were at an outside picnic on Labor Day instead of inside visiting. The windows were closed, locking in a stale air. No matter what time of year, Grandma was always afraid of getting chilled and catching pneumonia. Brian yawned. Grandpa turned to Dad. So, Stan, how goes the war? What are you guys doing to make sure the paper mill hears you? We're out here with picket signs, Dad said. He looked at Grandpa in the eyes. We're shaking things up and not letting them forget about us. Mom looked at Dad and crossed her arms. It's too much shaking up if you ask me. People are going to get hurt if this town doesn't settle down. Personally, she said in a level voice, I've had enough, thank you. Brian looked at his parents' stern faces. The tension was thick as a wet cement. The pain jabbed him. He knew of plenty of kids whose parents had divorced. Could this strike break up his parents? He sure hoped not. His dad's eyes met Brian's. He nodded slightly, as if to warn Brian not to mention a word about last night. Brian nodded back and forced a slight smile. Grandpa leaned forward onto his knees and picked up his cane. He pounded it on the floor. Stan, you gotta get mad. You've never really known what it meant to put up a fight. Dad moved his lips as though he were ready to speak, and then stopped. He stood up and paced in front of the 3-tiered plant stand by the window. Grandpa, he said, soothing the air with a flat of his hand, we've got it under control, trust me. Under control? The spider veins on Grandpa's face grew redder. You've got to get mad and fight. I disagree, Mom said. She carefully folded her hands over her crossed knees. Grandpa glared at her as though she didn't have the right to disagree. That's the exact attitude I try to correct in my first graders, Mom continued. If people always have to fight to solve problems, then what kind of world is it? Sure, I want Stan to be able to go to work here, but if things don't go his way, we'll get by somehow. If we have to move, then we'll move. Her fingers were laced together, her knuckles turning white. I don't want to move, Brian joined in, tapping his right heel nervously on the carpet. Where else could I get such a good hockey team? Besides, we're going to have a great Pee-wee season, but we can't do without Dad. He hadn't meant to get involved in the conversation, but it slipped out. Maybe he was getting older after all. He sat up straighter. Dad gave him a wink as if he just scored a goal. Grandma Effie cleared her throat. Well, it's different in some ways. The workers get paid pretty well. Grandpa didn't buy his new pickup without making some pretty good wages over the years at the mill. Things aren't as desperate as back then. No, it's different these days. Same thing, Grandpa said, and he pounded his cane down twice. The coffee table vibrated. Howard, said Grandma, be careful. I think Grandpa's right, Brian said, glancing at Dad. Dad had made it clear he didn't want him to get too involved, but he hadn't forbidden him from speaking. This strike is no different than Grandpa's strike. We've got to fight for our rights, now, just like then, whatever it takes. Mom looked sideways at Brian and Dad, and then slowly shook her head.